Very excited to hear all about you and IdRamp here in a second. I will kind of re-say, because I see we had some additional participants join us. The Startup Spotlight is a really interesting opportunity for folks like Mike as well as ourselves, because we really do think that these companies are on the bleeding edge of this space. We firmly here at OWI do believe that they're onto something really spectacular, and so we love to have you guys check that out as well. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mike. Tell us a little bit about yourself and jump right in, and then we'll be talking again in 15 minutes.
Sure. Thanks, Travis. Yeah, excited to be here. Thanks for the intro, and hope maybe we get the opportunity to prove Dave right here in the next 10, 15 minutes. So some of his predictions. That was a great segment. So my name is Mike Vesey. I'll give you a little background on IdRamp. IdRamp is a service delivery fabric designed from the ground up to add velocity and future-proof identity and access management investments. So IdRamp achieves this by disrupting the traditional one-to-one relationship between service and identity. Instead, we allow organizations to bring any system or any data source they want to use for identity, and then also bring in any service, cloud or local, that they want to deliver to their employees, partners, or customers. We can bring in MFA providers, biometric verifiers, or W3C verifiable credentials, verification systems, and plug those into IdRamp. The organization can even invite business partners or vendors to share applications or bring their own identity providers to truly build a service delivery ecosystem. So really traditional stuff, and we're putting a new technology edge on it and allowing a lot of flexibility. So now that an organization has all those raw materials for service delivery, IdRamp provides them complete control over the service delivery orchestration process. So we can easily mix and match different identity or multi-factor providers to achieve an exact delivery experience on a service-by-service basis. IdRamp can act as a federation translator, if you will, allowing a service that may only know SSO authentications via OAuth or OIDC, and join those to an identity provider that may only be capable of speaking SAML. No complex identity or no complex developments required during that process. While we're talking about translators, let's get right to digital verifiable credentials, because there was a lot talked about blockchain identity. Digital verification credentials are really the evolution, in my opinion, of that blockchain ID and what it's become in the market that's actually usable today. So everywhere we go today, we're hearing about governments and organizations investing in researching and verifiable credentials as a means of further decentralizing and securing their identity landscapes. There's tremendous energy around self-sovereign identity or educational achievement credentials, but there's always the question, how do we actually use this technology? Travis, you and Dave just touched on this in that last segment, right? Where can we actually see the change and see it happening? So as Trust over IP steering members, as well as sovereign and DCO stewards, IdRamp is firmly committed to the technology and the direction, and supports a full suite of credential management tools, allowing seamless integration of this new technology without any developer involvement. And we bake that right into the IdRamp platform for service delivery. For those that want a little deeper integration, IdRamp also has full stack API, as well as our Passport API, which is focused specifically on the verifiable credential components, issuance, and verifications. Well, that's enough talk. Let's jump into IdRamp. We're going to do a live demo. Those always go so well. And we're going to look at a few things that I've explained here. I'd like to introduce Carl Kanice, who's IdRamp COO, master of the live demo. Carl, can you please share out and help us go through a demonstration of IdRamp?
Hi, Mike. I'm sharing my screen now. Verify that you see what you want.
Yep, got it. Looks great.
Also, would just underline what a great segue into the IdRamp platform, because a large part of our focus has been on adopting innovative technologies like what was described as blockchain or ledger-based verifiable credentials, and making them work today without hiring a development team or without having to, disrupt existing legacy systems. So excited to share that here.
Yeah, we're going to go through it. It's going to be exciting. So, Carl, let's take a look first at the identity providers, because I know there's this client called the client name my company that Carl created. He's loaded in some identity providers here. These are usual suspects, right? I mean, these are things that organizations are using in their identity workflows, in the service delivery workflows today. The difference is IdRamp just sees them as tools, right? So we plug them and mix them and match them. Social identity providers, Carl, you can show the social logins. Of course, those are all supported. Even, decentralizing the organization, and a lot of organizations today is really just, trying to achieve social login compatibility and allow for the first step in decentralization. So we're happy to be able to provide some of that orchestration here as well. Factor providers, you can bring any multi-factor provider you would like to plug in here. And also, again, IdRamp is all about the orchestration of that service delivery experience. So let's get right to that. I don't want to run out of time. So let's pick a service. Here we have some services we've configured. We're going to take the company Zoom account, right? Like all of us use to join here. And we're going to change that. We're going to change that up a little bit. So right now, out of the box, this Zoom instance is configured to use Azure Active Directory. It's enabled and it's allowed to all users. This is just standard authentication stuff. IdRamp, of course, supports rules, in the conditional section where we can tailor to only certain groups within that Active Directory. Very, traditional thing. You'd expect to see this in any kind of an identity and access management system. We can support consents, so you can load in a consent if you want, also orchestrating that into the workflow, or of course, any multi-factor. So you have complete control over that experience. Before we go too far though, show the experience, Carl. I just want to show when we log into the Zoom account, it does exactly what you'd expect it to do, right? It defers you over to Microsoft and says, hey, let's log in. And, Carl could log into to Zoom using Active Directory. Instead, let's go back to IdRamp, Carl, and let's just assume we're going to change from Azure to maybe Google. How complex is that with IdRamp? So we pick another identity provider, we enable it, we can disable Azure, enable Google Consumer, go back to the login experience, and it does exactly what you would expect it to do. Now it's going to defer us to Google. Here's where the really cool stuff comes in. IdRamp, as I mentioned, supports verifiable credentials, and it's baked right into this interface. So what I would like to do first, Carl, is let's put if you don't mind sharing your mobile device, let's put a digital credential in your mobile device that's issued from that Azure Active Directory data source, so that we can see what that looks like. So under Carl's services, you can see he has a service that showed up here called the Employee ID AAD, a very descriptive name. That is an employee credential. So we configured an employee credential based on his Azure Active Directory login. When he logged into IdRamp here using his Active Directory, it said, oh, you're entitled to this credential, and it's listing it for him. So go ahead and scan that, Carl. That when he launches, it's basically going to present him this credential. And this credential is going to be stored on his device, only on his device. Right? It's the only place this information is going to live is on his mobile device, but there is a verification record out on the ledger that will be referenced when Carl tries to present this credential to log in. So now we have this credential, it's loaded into his wallet. Let's go back to the IdRamp service configuration and take our Zoom instance, and instead let's enable that with a digital credential. So pretty complicated stuff, right? Well, just select digital credential, enable it, and we're done. So literally we can enable, and we can leave those other services enabled. So when we log in now, you notice we still have Google enabled. IdRamp is going to say, oh wait, hey, there's two different ways you can interface, because Google, we left Google enabled. So this time, go ahead and log in, Carl, with digital credential. IdRamp, Zoom knows nothing about digital credentials, right? It knows SAML or OAuth or OIDC, but IdRamp does. And so IdRamp is basically offering this to Carl. He's going to log in to Zoom, or he's going to log in to Zoom through IdRamp. IdRamp's going to pass back the standard user authentication message that that you'd expect to see. So it's just that easy. Within a few minutes, we completely removed the need for a password to log into Zoom. It's gone. It's now being carried in this digital credential issued by his organization. Of course, those credentials can be much more portable, but we see enabling enterprise credentials as a way to really bootstrap the digital credential economy and get these things out in the wild. So that was a real quick example. Let's go back and show a couple other things so we don't run out of time. Analytics is very interesting, Carl. Show analytics for a second. There's not a lot of data loaded here in this demo system, but You can pick any of the services you have configured in IdRamp, and you can literally plot them out on a graph. You can show trends in usage, whether they're increasing and need additional financial investment, or if they're in decline and maybe need to be decommissioned or certainly scaled back. And the ability to stack these services on top of each other and see them all in one graph gives you a very comprehensive view of what's going on within the enterprise from a service delivery perspective. As you would expect, we can also take those same identity sources and build complex graphs based on those as well. So you really get a complex picture of what's going on in the system here. So with that, I think I will sum it up. Do you have anything else, Carl, that you think we should go through? We touched on rules briefly.
Yeah, as you were saying there, we have a rules engine that allows you to provide sort of attribute-based access control. And I mean, and I think, you know, one of the punchlines of our recent investments has been, again, practical adaptation of what was described as decentralized identity and bringing it into an ecosystem and allowing our customers to deploy these new technologies, gain better security, gain easy adoption of that without really disrupting their investments. So thanks, Mike.
Sure. Yeah. And yeah, so there's some interesting questions coming in as well that I've kind of been reading, and it's great. It leads right into, you know, into some of the things that we touched on. So Travis, do you want me to jump in and start answering some of those or?
Yeah, please
Okay.
do.
Sure. So one was on scale. If you think about what we're doing in IdRamp, IdRamp is providing that service layer between the identity and the service. The ability of having IdRamp there actually increases scale of service delivery because we're offloading a lot of that proprietary backhauled information back to the identity source. If you couple that with the verifiable credentials that we demoed in there, now you're completely fracturing that dependency on IAM. In fact, you know, the IdRamp IAM that we issue our credentials from sits completely behind a firewall. It's not exposed to the public at all. Whenever we do our service authentications, we use those verifiable credentials so that we don't have to make a connection back to the honeypot. This, as far as you know, as far as scale user authentications, this is deployed globally in multinational organizations. We've seen it's in front of a webcasting system. We've seen 60,000 participants within a 2-minute window come through IdRamp, and we're certainly not even close to our scale there because of the architecture and the way that we have it designed. So so scale is a great it's a great advantage actually to having IdRamp there because we provide that some caching, if you will, for the sessions and keep that traffic off the identity management system. Another question that came in is about account recovery. Yeah, account recovery is a major pain. And what we just went through with Carl in that 5-minute demo, we went through and demonstrated issuing a digital credential to Carl that he loads onto an identity wallet. And this is all interchangeable. The most exciting thing about this technology is that we as an industry are finally coming together and setting some standards. There are a handful of vendors in the market right now that can take that digital credential that we scanned into that wallet that Carl was showing. So you can choose your own products and you can carry that with you. But if you think about account recovery, it really kind of eliminates that. You can have those credentials issued and they sit in that wallet. Sure, if the wallet is lost, needs to be rebuilt, you can go back through that process. But password elimination will save thousands of dollars in the traditional IT costs that are incurred today just managing those processes. Let's see. Issue on pricing model per seat per auth. We're really flexible. We work with organizations that have a lot of their own ideas on how things should be priced. Typically, access model is the most fair. It's based on what you use, and we have that model successfully deployed today, and it works quite well. All depending on scale and volume, of course, for what those, and we'll be happy to engage in any of those conversations if you want.
The customers that demand per seat, that's certainly there.
Yeah.
As well.
So here's an interesting one about multi-tenant and because I touched on this when I was mentioning ecosystem, and this is kind of a lot to get your head around, but absolutely, IdRamp is designed for, like I said, an ecosystem. So you can have 5 or 6 other organizations, or maybe their business divisions or whatever, that all have their own identity infrastructure. Our belief is, instead of traditional federation where if you and somebody in my partnership wants to use my service, I have to have a user in my identity system to allow them authentication. IdRamp completely fractures and decentralizes that. So I can take that same Zoom instance and I can share it with a business partner. They can bring their own identity and access management system, and they can orchestrate that flow themselves, right? So it absolutely it's designed for a multi-tenant, multiple company design from the beginning. We saw that was going to be a very key feature, was the ability to build ecosystems and communities of authentications, if you will, or business relationships. So that's baked right in, and
Well,
we're excited that, the interesting thing about what we're doing is we're strongly rooted in traditional identity, right? We've got the ability to interface with all of these traditional identity sources. But we also have, bleeding edge, cutting edge technology that we can affect some real change in the market with today. So this is not, let's wait for the world to change. We have to wait for state issued driver's licenses. We can deploy this technology on our own terms within the enterprise and let that slowly grow the community of credentials that are available. And when the state driver's license comes out, great. I won't go and ask my identity and access management system anymore. Maybe I'll just ask for a proof. And IdRamp can help you orchestrate all of that today. The interface that Carl was showing is actively tied to multiple different layer 1 utility ledgers. So, we can help transcode some of that and make sure we have routability between those as they grow and as those standards continue to emerge.
And the privileged access approach we use now for that for the ecosystem management, the administration is correlated to verifiable credentials, but it can also be acclimated to any PAM requirements in the enterprise. I would really like to hit on that last question though, Mike, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I was just reading that too. Yeah, last question is about self-sovereign identity and how it becomes a reality and when it becomes a reality. And the thing I always think is interesting when we talk to people about self-sovereign identity is that sometimes the purists all the time, they assume too much, right? What is self-sovereign identity, right? Where does it start? It's the classic chicken and egg. So we believe that self-sovereign identity starts by taking small things like an enterprise identity, or like the fact that I am a member of some club or organization, and pushing those things out into my wallet. Self-sovereign identity becomes a thing when we have a collection of credentials that we can cross-reference and compile that give you that identity vision of me. It just doesn't magically start. So I think the crossover point is when the market becomes big enough that instead of building an identity solution, I ask for a credential that I know exists. And once we affect enough change in the market and get enough credentials on the scene, that becomes a thing. And we see it becoming a thing in our ecosystem, to be clear, right? IdRamp says our vision is we're going to create those ecosystems, and we're going to let 5 or 6 organizations come together and say, we want to create our own governance, and we want to deploy credentials, and we want to make those credentials interoperable within our ecosystem. And the trust fabric, the governance is all there. Everything's tied together, and we can start using them. Sure, those credentials can be verified outside of that small ecosystem, and that's what we hope. We hope that others say, well, why don't we just use this? Why don't we just use this credential? That's when the changeover starts to happen, is really when it's when we don't have to create an identity to prove an identity. That's when we're fully on our way to a self-sovereign world. And as David pointed out rightly, that's a ways down the road. There's some challenges we have to solve. So our technology and our vision is to solve what we know we can solve today, put the new technology inside a sandbox or inside a controlled ecosystem where it can grow and evolve and affect that change until the market adopts it fully.
And I would just punctuate that with, the previous presentation was describing the similar answer, and it was described as when you start using self-sovereign identity without even knowing it. And that is what's happening today. For example, we're working with a national utility company to deploy 5 million verifiable credentials into their ecosystem. They're about solving some business problems. They're not really about the religion of self-sovereign identity or blockchain. So that practical change is starting to happen in business behind the scenes now, but not as some kind of a battle cry for self-sovereign or some kind of a ideological promise. So it's happening.
That's an excellent point, Carl. And I would argue what you just demoed with your wallet, we were solving a business problem. We weren't consciously using a new technology. We were just solving the problem of you forgetting your password and not wanting to deal with passwords, solving the problem of honeypot of data, solving the problem of enterprise IAM system velocity, all of those things. And it was really seamless to you as a user.
Yeah. And just to jump